Hello and welcome to a new episode of Bingley Talks Politics with myself, Mr. Booth, to my left,
Finn,
to my right,
Mr. Cook.
Obviously it doesn't really matter for listeners whether they're sitting on my left or my right, but we're all here and we're going to discuss today, the topic is, well, it's the state. Well, Finn, what have you got a question? It's just, you came up with this one, so how would you want to phrase it?
Yeah, I suppose how strong is our democracy in the UK? And kind of putting that into a wider context, is too much democracy bad for the existence of democracy?
Yeah,
sort of.
Which sounds really convoluted, but we'll try to unpick that a little bit later when we've had a good talk about certain things about our democracy in terms of the UK, British democracy. Because I think, let's start, democracy, what do we mean by democracy, Mr. Cook?
I guess the people control the government.
Yeah. I mean, it's power of the people, isn't it? People power. And, right, so that's fairly simple to understand, but then it gets perhaps a little bit more complicated. So we do consider ourselves, I think, a democracy. And vast majority of people, maybe not all, but the vast majority of people think that's important and like that idea. Would you agree?
Absolutely,
Yeah?
Yeah.
That doesn't so far so uncontroversial. However, democracy isn't just one thing, isn't it? It's not an off-the-shelf product that is easily defined. It works differently in different countries. You have different systems. You have different ways of electing your leader, different electoral systems, and quite a lot of other things that can vary from country to country. And obviously, not all countries would consider themselves democracies. So there's quite a lot of issues that we could get onto. We'll try to keep it relatively straightforward with two or three big things within the state of Britain. So the first one is the people who end up being powerful and usually leaders. So obviously the leader of the Conservative Party at the moment is the Prime Minister. We've got a leader of the Labour Party, leader of other political parties. We've got senior figures within both parties, and we've got other powerful people. And I think we perhaps could talk about how they get there, what they do when they are there, how healthy is that for democracy? Are they democratic leaders? There's lots of other things we could talk about. Finn, what's your take on this then?
So I think you've kind of got two types of leaders, and the first type is just your bog standard Democrat. And, typical examples of that is when George H.W. Bush was running for election and lost against Clinton. And obviously there was that kind of, oh, well done, man, done really well, all that. You contrast that with your demagogues, and that they're kind of populists like Donald Trump, who rose through the ranks with quite anti-democratic views. So he was talking about the election being rigged against him, crooked Hillary, these kind of really quite visceral accusations of your opponents. And, depending on whether or not you're a Democrat or an anti-Democrat, it's quite a clear distinguishment to make, and it's fairly obvious. People who are anti-democratic are normally quite obviously anti-democratic, such as Hitler, because when he rose to power, he'd staged a coup, or tried to stage a coup. You look at Mussolini, he'd done exactly the same. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. These are all telltale signs, and it's blindingly obvious to see. But the question is, how do you stop them from
Well,
rising
let me just
to
pin you down a little bit on this, and maybe Mr. Cook can chip in as well. Well, let's just focus on Britain then, because a lot of the leaders you mentioned you did a sort of whistle-stop tour around the globe there of very important leaders, and obviously Trump still lives large in the memory. Do those sorts of leaders exist in Britain? And what I'm talking about are the ones who maybe would be considered to endanger a certain democratic spirit, endanger democracy.
Well, you could say, and you'll know a lot more, Mr. Cook, about like the history a long way back. But in terms of modern history, that's most of what I know. I don't think Boris Johnson, really. He's the one who comes the closest, but he's still not very close. He's still respected democracy. And in Britain, we haven't really seen any anti-democratic leaders overtly. And
we've not seen, if we just keep it, so if we look at the 6th of January Capitol insurrection in the USA, I can't think of a similar event to that level in recent modern British political history. It's a bit of a mouthful. Mr. Cook, is that fair? Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking in my head what first comes to mind. Obviously, I see where you're going with prorogation, right? Was perceived as this kind of like quite heavy-handed, coup d'etat kind of thing where they just kind of smashed Parliament to one side. But
so this is Johnson as part of the Brexit.
Back in 2019.
Yeah.
The whole strategy to get
to sideline Parliament essentially to get Brexit done.
Yeah, because the idea was that they were voting on these extensions, right, to Article 50, and they wanted to get that off the table. And in a sense, you can say, well, yeah, it's not exactly democratic in the sense Parliament is making decisions, the elected body. But our constitution does allow for it, or did allow for it prior to the Supreme Court ruling against it, right? The other example, to play devil's advocate a bit, is Ted Heath that I can think of. A lot of people, a lot of my friends at least, think Ted Heath taking Britain into the EEC without a referendum. And a lot of the Roy Jenkins, with his Red Book in Parliament, for instance, whipping Labour MPs and Liberals, was quite heavy-handed to an extent. But again, the system allows for whipping, aggressive whipping. You can be aggressive as you like up to an extent with it, so... But you'd have to go really far back, like the 1800s, I think, when you had boroughs, you had wards, people paid to get seats. It was only after... Yeah,
it's a bit like the passage of foreign country there, really, isn't it, in terms of the political landscape, and we're making...
It's completely different,
Yeah.
But I suppose that after, the 1900s, 20th century, I can't think of a single episode where you had Parliament being stormed or anything, you had the Buckingham Palace or the Lords being stormed. I can't think of anything.
Or even close.
Or even close, yeah.
In terms of a popular
even prorogation at the time was within the confines of...
And you could also argue, although they might not have taken much notice, the actions of the Supreme Court strengthened democracy, and in that process there was a relatively swift check and calling out of that particular decision.
And this is where the judiciary is an important aspect.
So far, so good, we think.
For the UK.
Yeah. Other leaders that are knocking about or other key figures in current British politics, do we see any particular problems there, or are they all respectful of democracy and want to perhaps even enhance democracy?
I think Boris is, like you said, probably the closest we can get in since Boris had those. There's going to be a lot of dirty laundry.
So if I just throw out some other figure, I mean, Rishi Sunak, any concerns?
I think no, not really.
Keir Starmer,
no.
Davey from the Liberal Democrats,
and even saying Boris, it's not like I think he would, get some like black shirts and march down the street. That's not him, right? It's more the scandalous aspect.
I hope not. Anyway, yeah.
More the scandalous aspect of Boris.
Well, Braverman maybe, but then I think she just uses rhetoric for the sake of using it, really. I don't think she'd be able to whip up populists. But, I mean, the other characters that you can talk about are the gatekeepers of democracy, the people the institutions that guard it. You're talking about like how in the 2019 general election there was like a mass movement of funding against Labour to keep Jeremy Corbyn out, even though he wasn't overtly anti-democratic. He was very, very democratic, very pro-democracy. But you have got these institutions which probably undemocratically guard from certain candidates, and these are in every good democracy.
Can people become part of that as easily as they could? So we're widening it out from the leaders, maybe. Let's look at the people involved in our political offices, so MPs, obviously, and various layers of government. Is it the case that people can join in and can seek to be a part of that, should they wish to become an MP? Is that a democratic process?
The one man that always stands out to me here, because he goes on about it relentlessly, is Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens has tried to stand as an MP supposedly numerous times, and the Tory party will not have him. But I guess that's your point, right, Finn, because he's quite an extreme radical figure, Peter Hitchens, when compared to most standard MPs and stuff.
I mean, someone has to decide, don't they, who gets to stand in a constituency.
And at the end of the day, they're self-interested. So they're
Yeah.
not going to elect an unelectable candidate, although with extreme
And
radical
I suppose
views.
in a process like that, with 650 seats up for grabs, there's always going to be something that might be up for debate and whether that decision should have been made. It's whether there's a severe deficiency in the system, I suppose. I mean, the most obviously recent issues over the last 20, 30 years would be, are enough women allowed to stand, people from different backgrounds and minorities. Now, I know all parties have tried through certain shortlisting procedures to boost representation across different elements of society. I think it's starting to feed in to that. This is, I suppose, more about equality than democracy, but they do have an overlap, I think it's fair to say, in certain ways. So, are there any concerns? We're trying to discuss whether there's a concern about the state of British democracy in all that process, how you get to be part of the game if you wanted to. Is there a problem?
In terms of becoming an MP?
Yeah, or trying to be involved in political power.
I think it is difficult for most regular people.
Are we still run by old white men?
Are we?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, looking at the current Prime Minister, obviously not in a sense. If you look at the past few Prime Ministers, right, Rishi Sunak, I forget her name, that interlude Liz Truss, basically, female, right? Boris, Prime, Theresa May, and then you can go back to Cameron, Brown, Blair, Thatcher. I think it's, like you said, I think it's getting better. I think we're seeing it, right? We're seeing the fruits of this emphasis. Like you said, equality and democracy do go hand in hand to an extent. You need representation.
Yeah.
But I think you'll have more to say as a teenager. Sorry.
Yeah. It's a bit difficult because it's not to become an MP. Peter Hitchens, he's a fantastic case, right? So he's tried to run for the Conservative Party, he can't run. They've blocked him. Where else can he go? Well, he can stand as an independent. He can start his own party. Lawrence Fox, him. He's an actor. He's
right, yeah.
A little bit of a nut job, but
That's one description. He's a fine actor. So leave it at that. Yeah.
But in UK democracy, you can argue that the system of parties vetting candidates is undemocratic. We are blocking these people out. But the fact is that the Conservative Party would not field Peter Hitchens and somebody like Lawrence Fox. And if they stand as independents, they've probably got no chance. I mean, you look at how UKIP did. Was getting 18% in some polls before 2015, and it only came out with 2 seats. And I think they might have even lost one because they had defections and
also, I mean, what would be the alternative to choosing people to stand for? Assuming that you think a parliament is a good idea and an important part of a representative democracy, which many people think it is, how do you choose perfectly fairly? It's difficult, isn't it? I was just thinking, what is the alternative? It's always what's the alternative? If you don't want it to do it, if there's a big problem, what's the alternative? I say they have thought about this. I would imagine is a fair comment to say it's a work in progress. But it's probably fair to say, government isn't dominated by the same sort of people as much as the cabinet in the 1980s or even 1990s. Certainly the first part. Okay, so there's not a huge concern about the leaders. 1 or 2 points were mentioned. There's not a huge concern about the people in power. Perhaps 1 or 2 other issues. How we perhaps vote is maybe something that people might be interested in. Do our voting systems, and we can talk about general elections, we can talk about other sorts of elections, we can talk briefly about whether we need to have more things like referendums in society. Would that make it more democratic? How well is Britain doing in terms of voting? We could talk about, if you like, about does it enfranchise young people effectively? Could we change that? I mean, should we start with that?
Yeah.
Should 16-year-olds vote? Would it be more democratic if we could?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of different issues with the way we vote. Our voting patterns, how there's these regulations that have come recently, got to go the voting card, and it could block some people out from voting, etc., etc. But I think one of the best things that we've got, and there was a podcast, as you know, our competitors, Resist Politics, with Francois Hollande, the French president, and he made a point that one of the best things about our democracy in the UK is that we've still got two parties.
He did, yeah, he liked that, didn't he?
If you look at France, there's loads of different parties. Netherlands is a brilliant case. They've got 20 different parties there. So many extremists, and they surge at completely random points, nut jobs, and they get into Parliament. Whereas here, you've got to go through the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, or if you're lucky, the Liberal Democrats. And that's kind of it, really.
I think he came across as it sort of stabilises the process.
Yeah.
And again, what's the alternative? Because we've got obvious examples from history where you open it up to lots of different parties, and that can go quite horribly wrong in some situations. We've already mentioned Germany in the 1920s and 30s. You've got other examples where, okay, the country might not turn into a dictatorship because of it or collapse because of it, but how do you share power across so many different parties? And does that actually, is that really what people want as part of their system? Does it just create more argument and conflict and problems if you change that? So the party system within the it's an interesting one, isn't it? There's pros and cons, really. It strikes me as a theme that's coming up when you talk about democracy in Britain or anywhere indeed, but it's a sort of fine balance. There's a balancing act to perform here. You can't have everything. This idea of like a pure democracy is difficult to attain. Is that fair?
I don't think it ever existed. I think if you look at, I find it fascinating looking at the influences that the Roman republics had on like the American Constitution, and even over here to an extent. But you see it much more powerfully in America, don't you, with the idea of the Senate and over there, for instance, separation of powers, co-consuls, judiciary, president, executive, all that stuff. I think even back in the Roman Republic, it wasn't perfect. I mean, you had a lot of corruption, you had a lot of bribery going on. I will say about the parties over here, I think there is a risk when you've got the two political parties, Labour and the Tories, right, that they do end up stale, right, that the ideas are, because they've got this gatekeeping aspect where only certain people get to become an MP, the policy vision can become very stagnant, and because it's first past the post, it's near impossible. I mean, I'm not a UKIP supporter, but UKIP getting surprise. But UKIP getting the third most amount of votes in 2015 and 2 seats shows that even if you do have quite a radical alternative third party, it can be a left-wing party, it's not going to break through even if it's popular.
Yeah.
And was it Brexit Party? What was it? It was the Brexit Party it was called, the 2019 one. Even that basically ended up being a pressure group essentially, and he had to basically pull candidates aside in favour of Tories. So it's really difficult. I get what Alon's saying, but I do think there's a risk there, and it's like you said, it's not going to be perfect. There's trade-offs, right? Do you want stability or ingenuity? And it's the times and the periods demand different things, don't they, as well? That's the difficult thing about it.
I suppose you broaden it out to like how, if we did have a proportional representation system, one of the examples of how you can have that and still defend democracies in Belgium in the 1930s when there was like the far-right parties coming up through the ranks, and then the Catholic Party, which the far-right party split off from. They had to form a popular front, and they did it in France as well under Léon Blum. A popular front with the socialists and the liberals, who were their historic enemies, and they basically had to put their ideology aside and say, well, we've got to unite in defence of democracy. And obviously a few years later that failed because they got invaded. Same for France as well. But they managed to unite in this popular front and work together in the interest of democracy while still keeping that democratic system in place and not really compromising on the levels of democracy that they had. So, there are different ways you can work around. I mean, you see it in France today with they still call it the Republican Front. Everybody vote for Macron, even if you hate Macron and everything he stands for, he's better than Marine Le Pen. But I suppose in the UK that, to an extent, because we've only got two parties, we can never really have that But then I suppose
I think the UK's got some big ticks in the column of keeping out extremist parties over, well, its history, certainly modern British political history. And I don't think that, in the context of the 20th century in Europe, should be understated. I think that's a really important factor. There's been a bit of turbulence in the last 10 to 20 years, perhaps. But again, it's again that balancing act. Undoubtedly, our electoral system can be deemed as undemocratic in the way that you can actually get more votes in the country and still not get into government. It's happened twice, hasn't it, in the last 100 years, because of the way the seats work and because of the way the system works first past the post. It's a very sort of straightforward system, sort of simple system, and therefore it is dominated largely by two parties. It's very hard to break through. You might not represent all interests. We've said that there's quite a few problems with it, but then there's quite a few problems with whatever system. As we said, the alternative, we could be a number of different systems. And I think, proportional representation shouldn't just be dismissed as just one system, because it isn't. There's a number of different ways you could do it.
It's going to be different in each country as well, isn't
yeah.
it?
So I think there's one. I think it's interesting. Okay, here we go. And this is a combination of the voting system, a current trend, a little bit of the sort of the way the UK works. However, how does the Labour Party win a general election? And I'm not making a point about the Labour Party here, I'm making a point about democracy. Because unless you have a bit of a seesaw to and fro, you might end up having the same party in power. And I'm not sure that is, which would be the Conservatives. I'm not sure whether that would be healthy for democracy. Why has that come to be? Well, a number of issues, but one of them is Scotland, where the Scottish National Party win a huge amount of seats, and 20 years ago they didn't. Labour have got a possible chance of making some inroads, but are going to find it difficult to get anywhere close to what they used to do in Scotland, which makes their chance of overall victory in the UK a lot less. So if you've got Conservative hegemony, really, Conservatives winning again and again, or the best that other parties can do is to hope from some sort of minority, some sort of coalition deal, do we have a problem there?
Is that...
It's a leading question, isn't it?
It's the tensions, isn't it, trying to get through the system, I think. And I think it's the incapacity of some politicians to adapt to basically the changing circumstances and what the electorate wants, right? Funnily enough, I think keeping extremists out over the past few hundred years, we've got a lot to thank the Tories for, to an extent, because they do just reinvent themselves, right? They just shift, and they're not going to risk not getting power by being incredibly reactionary, are they? They're not going to do it.
Best election winning machine going, Conservative
really?
Party.
I think we're doing all right in this country, but there's some things that can change, and I think a lot of it is down to the incapacity of our politicians.
I am concerned, though, first to bang the drum of this hegemony of one party, because you could have quite a few consequences. Let me suggest a few. So if you vote for another party, voter apathy might increase, because you're like, well, how on earth is my vote registering here? Because every time I vote, and I've used this argument again for young voters who don't see their vote necessarily translate into forms of power. Every time I vote, the person I vote for doesn't seem to have much of a chance of getting close to government. So, how do you react to that? Well, you can be apathetic, you can be angry, or you can be something in between. That's a problem, potentially.
Especially among young people, right?
Yeah, well, I think so. Finn, we always come to you for the young person's view. So give us it, please, Finn.
It's a strange thing. I mean, obviously, we started this off by talking is too much democracy bad for democracy? Is too much gatekeeping bad for democracy as well? You look at how Tony Blair won a general election in 2019. He went off to Rupert Murdoch's private island. He had all the businessmen piling in behind him. You see very much what's happening with Keir Starmer now. And there are these quite powerful forces who have an indirect influence on democracy, who act from a distance, but they are not democratically elected, and they're not part of the official democratic process. And that does contribute to, the fact that, 18 years, 1979 to 1997, Tories in power. We do have these patterns of repeating government, and is that part of the ruling establishment almost deciding, well, it's time for Labour now, or do you know what, I fancy a Conservative government in, I'll ring up David and get him.
Yeah, it could be, couldn't it? It could be. There's a little bit of that, but then there's also, a combination of people moving and times changing and events. I just think it's, and obviously you get to boil it down to now it's your turn, back to us. I mean, it's not really how it should work. And it's not how it has worked, has it? Because the Conservatives have had far more time in government than the Labour Party have. But it is a concern if you feel you can't access power. If you feel you can't access power, whether that's you as an individual, or your vote not really contributing to that, I see that as a concern going forward.
And it's where dark things fester. People feel like
that's
they have
not a good thing.
Not a good thing. People feel like they just have no control over it. Because this is the thing. If you had a government that wasn't very democratic, because I'm going to Singapore as an example here. There's elections in Singapore. Everyone votes for PAP, but PAP also go after the opposition and trump charges on them and stuff. But there's not been a huge backlash in Singapore because the government seems to deliver year on year on growth, wage growth, public services getting better, technology being adopted more and more in terms of social services, and there isn't actually a kickback against that. Even though people are aware they don't actually have much say over the government, they're happy enough that it does a job. Whereas I think in a lot of Western Europe, it's the other way around. A lot of people don't see governments solving problems, and then they also don't see ways of getting them out. If you know what I mean.
Well, I mean, I don't want to go back to Germany again, but off we go. That's the archetypal example of where things, the perfect storm analogy I don't really like, but it kind of works, doesn't it? In the fact that the political system, which was uber democratic in the Weimar Republic, but the problems, the socio-economic problems, the impact of the depression, unemployment, and all the rest of it, and the government not being able to handle it, and look what you end up with. I've simplified, but a lot of that is pretty accurate. Well, how far can you... the economic weather, if you like, doesn't look hugely promising at the moment. It's volatile, and therefore that creates a question mark, I think, for Britain and its democracy. I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, especially in Britain, we've got to be a bit more vigilant because we don't have a constitution, and so the way in which things work in here, in Britain, are slightly more vague, and there is a potential that you could somehow subvert. You see with the proroguing of Parliament, there are going to be loopholes because it's so complex. But it has worked for so long that you think maybe it'll be fine. But yeah, I kind of think with democracy, the thing that's got to be said is that to an extent, democracy is not controlled by the people. It's controlled by the people in government, the people in the establishment. Don't really like that word, but it describes the upper echelon of society quite well, and it's they who control democracy. And you think about 1930s Germany. And, obviously I make this argument a lot in my history essays, but I would say that Hitler never, ever was confirmed to be Chancellor until Hindenburg abdicated his political responsibility. Now, democracy should allow for, as you say, those dark feelings brewing, people feeling quite anti-democratic, people... thinking maybe we should have another system. Democracy should allow for that, but you should have somebody at the end of the day who can say, right, this is where I think that's a
fabulous point, Nat. I really like the idea of democracy has to accept that anti-democratic feeling, has to be able to cope with it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Has to be able to cope with it, manage it, allow it to grow almost, but then ultimately someone needs to manage it, if not quash it or reject it, something like that.
So a good case study, sorry, quickly, is you remember the Nick Griffin, BNP, right? And the whole debate about question time, should it be on question time and all that stuff. And then he got question time.
I watched it when it was.
Right, and our institutions destroyed him. Right, freedom of speech destroyed him. There was a rational argument against him, and the audience by the end of it thought he was ridiculous, he was laughable. And after that, the next election, BNP tanks, right? So, I think you're completely right. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, and this is where you interpret events and go back to America and some of the turbulence they're going through, or have gone through and probably still are. It's like, yes, it is, and I mean the insurrection at the Congress building was I think a little bit beyond this in many respects, but the institutions have to spring into action, whether that's a Supreme Court or the idea of free speech. These things spring into action, and okay, there are problems, but because that's why they're there, to try and protect the system. And if the system survives, then that's a good sign.
Yeah, I mean that's...
Is it robust enough? But the question for America is it robust enough to carry on? I think we're looking at Britain primarily today. I don't think Britain is in as tenuous, as fragile a state.
No, I mean we've never been in that situation. America has, and that's kind of a lot of the surprise of people in America thinking, oh, normally you see this happening in some faraway land. Now this is happening on our doorstep. But you've got to give them credit. The fact that the judiciary, it's got a lot to answer for in America, especially with the rule of law. How courts can decide. Roe v. Wade is a fantastic case for that. But the fact that when Trump said, oh, there's all of these fake ballots that Democrats, whatever he said. And the court said, there's no evidence for that. There's absolutely no evidence for that. You're wrong. And
it doesn't stop the noise, does it? But the democracy is still holding, at least partially firm. Yeah. I don't sense we have the issues with concerning about the dodgy voting that seems to constantly raise in America. It doesn't seem to be a thing really with UK democracy, so we seem to be doing okay there. I think we'll probably wrap it up for today. I don't think we've done probably as many issues as we would have liked, and a couple of things have cropped up as you were both speaking. I think the one with the Roman Republic and the idea that creates a question that we can perhaps pick up in let's say next week maybe is do we suffer though? And I'll use an analogy of, well, it can be an old-fashioned, it comes from a doll's house, Ibsen. That's a good cross-reference, isn't it? Now let me get, is it Torsten? Or Torvald? Anyway, the husband in that play, he controls the wife. However, the wife's life might be good if the husband allows her enough money, allows her to do whatever she likes. You could use a very similar analogy to master-slave relationship. So, you might say, well, what are you complaining about? Well, because you've got this, you can do that, you're allowed to do this, but you are completely, really dependent for your freedom on the person. So really, to work around that, how do you work around that? And we might be at a bit of a disadvantage in this country because we don't really have a robust constitution and a robust Bill of Rights.
Yeah. You know the Hennessy quote, don't you?
So
the Hennessy quote about good chaps and good practice.
yeah. Which is fine.
Yeah.
And as we say, it usually is okay. Is that enough for people? Because that ultimately, it could be exploited, that. And that's something that I know certain authors have looked at within sort of political systems, and I think Britain might just have an issue there. I think definitely another episode needs to be, when you were speaking, Finn, I was thinking about where we get our information from, and I thought, well, we can't really get onto the media today, but the media plays a massive role in democracy, and not just just where we get our information. That could be a whole episode, because I think we can then get into obviously misinformation, conspiracies and all the rest of it, because that plays a huge role in democracy, in making key decisions about democracy, but the way people think about it and so forth. I think we think Britain's doing okay.
We can sleep safe at night.
I suppose
for the moment.
For the moment.
The question is, with Britain, we've never really seen what democracy is like in peril. It's never been put under much,
huge
if
strain.
any, stress.
Yeah.
So what would it look like? And that's kind of where I was coming from, and how strong is democracy in the UK. I suppose we can't really answer that.
Well, let's keep this going as a theme for the next 2 or 3, and let's maybe play out a scenario where it could. Yeah. Do a bit of counterfactual, and think, well, could this happen? And we love a bit of counterfactual. Where we're that rounded and civilised creatures in this podcast team, aren't we? And on that note, thanks for listening, and see you next week.
See you next week. Goodbye.